What would you do if your home, the one place you thought was safe, was suddenly flooded with raw sewage? Imagine waking up to find your dream garden destroyed, your workshop in ruins, and the place you've worked your entire life to build now covered in filth. And when you call for help, the very people who are supposed to protect you, the ones who run your community, not only ignore you, they try to cover it up. But when you've had enough, when you've been pushed too far, there's only one thing left to do: fight back. But how far would you go when the system is stacked against you? And what happens when the revenge you seek goes further than you ever expected? This is the story of a battle against corruption, a fight for justice, and a revenge that nobody saw coming. Stay tuned, because this is where everything changes. It was a quiet morning when everything changed. Imagine waking up to the soft chirping of birds, the smell of fresh flowers wafting through the air, and the sight of your garden, the one you've spent years nurturing, in full bloom. You finally reached the stage of life where you're not chasing after anything. You've retired, and now it's time to enjoy the fruits of your hard work. For many of us in our later years, it's this peace, this tranquility that we've longed for. It's a reward after decades of labor, sacrifice, and struggle. But for one homeowner, that peace was about to be shattered in the most shocking way imaginable. One morning, the familiar scent of flowers was replaced with a stench so overwhelming that it hit them like a wave, a sharp reminder that something was terribly wrong. The backyard, once a garden full of life and color, was now covered with a thick brown puddle, sewage, raw and unchecked, flooding the land they had worked so hard to make beautiful. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was an invasion. The tranquil home they had spent decades building was now a nightmare, and they knew right away that something was deeply wrong. This sewage didn't appear by accident. No, it was the result of decisions made behind closed doors by a group of individuals who never even considered how their actions would affect someone like them. The homeowners had worked their entire lives, contributed to their community, only to be punished for it. The ones responsible, the Homeowners Association, an organization that was supposed to protect them, but instead it had become a force of manipulation and control. What would you do if you found yourself in such a situation? Would you sit back and take it feeling helpless? Or would you rise, fight for your home, and demand the justice you deserve? For our protagonist, this was no longer just about a flooded yard. It was about standing up for the right to live in peace, without fear or degradation. This was their home, and no one, no matter how powerful, had the right to destroy it. The Homeowners Association, or HOA, was supposed to ensure that the neighborhood remained a peaceful and attractive place for all its residents. But for some, it had become a tool for personal gain, greed, and power. The protagonist quickly learned that the HOA, once seen as a helpful entity, was now run by people who cared more about control than the well-being of the homeowners they were meant to serve. As the sewage continued to flood their yard, they called the HOA, expecting help, only to be met with indifference and dismissiveness. This is just a temporary side effect, they were told, as though the raw sewage ruining their property was no big deal. The HOA had no intention of fixing the issue anytime soon. They weren't concerned about the damage or the health hazards. It was as if they couldn't be bothered, and why should they care? They were protected, insulated by their power. As the protagonist tried to get answers, they found themselves constantly pushed aside, treated like their concerns didn't matter. The HOA president, Karen, who had long looked down on the protagonist for not fitting into the perfect mold of the community's wealthy elite, was particularly dismissive. "You should have thought about drainage issues before moving here," she said, coldly and with a sneer in her voice. This wasn't just about sewage. This was about control, about making the protagonist feel small, insignificant, and unworthy of even basic respect. But the protagonist refused to back down. They had already spent years working hard, building a life from the ground up. No one, not even an HOA, was going to strip away their dignity. They would fight no matter the odds, and they soon realized something even more alarming. The HOA's behavior wasn't just about negligence. It was part of a larger plan, a plan to drive them out, so they could take over the property, sell it to a developer, and pocket the profits. This is a lesson for all of us. Power, once abused, can become a monster. It can be a system designed not for protection, but for exploitation. The trick is knowing when to fight back, knowing when you've been wronged, and standing your ground with everything you've got. What seemed like a simple case of negligence soon turned into something much darker. The protagonist decided to investigate, determined to understand how this could have happened and why the HOA was so uninterested in solving the issue. They followed the flow of sewage uphill and soon found the source of the problem. A newly installed pipe, one that wasn't on any public records, and one that was spewing sewage directly onto their property. This wasn't just an accident, it was an intentional act. The protagonist took photos, videos, and began gathering evidence. They didn't just want to prove that the HOA was responsible. They wanted to expose a system that had been operating under the radar for years, taking advantage of its residents without anyone knowing. And soon, they found something even more shocking. They discovered that the HOA wasn't just guilty of negligence. They were actively engaging in corrupt practices, making secret deals with developers and contractors for personal gain. The sewage was just the tip of the iceberg. At this point, the protagonist realized something even more important. They weren't just fighting for their home. They were fighting against an entire system that had been preying on the community for years. The HOA wasn't just negligent, it was corrupt, and it was time to shine a light on the darkness that had been festering beneath the surface for so long. This is a powerful lesson for all of us. Sometimes problems are much deeper than they appear at first glance. It's easy to assume that what we're facing is a small inconvenience, but when we dig deeper, we often discover a web of corruption and manipulation. Never stop questioning. Never stop digging for the truth, because that's the only way to uncover the forces that are working against us. The sewage continued to pour onto the protagonist's property, and with it came the destruction of everything they had built. Their once beautiful garden was drowned in filth. Their workshop, a place where they spent countless hours building furniture and crafting pieces of their dreams, was now unusable. The tools that had once been an extension of their hands were soaked in raw sewage, ruined beyond repair. It wasn't just the physical damage that hurt. It was the emotional toll. This was their home, their sanctuary. It wasn't just a property. It was a reflection of years of hard work, sacrifice, and love. And now it was being destroyed in front of their eyes, all because of the greed and carelessness of a few people who had no idea what it meant to truly work for something. How do you cope when everything you've worked for is taken away in an instant? How do you find the strength to keep going when the world seems to turn against you? It's not easy, and the protagonists struggled. They felt helpless, angry, and defeated. But deep down, they knew one thing: they couldn't give up. They couldn't let the HOA's negligence and greed destroy their spirit. This is a lesson in resilience. Life isn't always fair. We can work hard, we can put in the effort, but sometimes things will fall apart. But the real question is, how do we respond when it does? Do we let the darkness swallow us, or do we rise above it, even when it feels like the world is against us? The protagonist's battle was far from over. The more they tried to get the HOA to take responsibility, the more they were met with gaslighting and denial. Karen, the HOA president, continued to dismiss their complaints, pretending that everything was fine. "It's just a minor issue," she said. "It's not a big deal." But the problem was much bigger than she let on. The sewage flooding the protagonist's yard wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a health hazard, a violation of basic human decency, and a deliberate act of negligence. At every turn, the HOA denied responsibility. They pushed the protagonist away, acting as though they had no obligation to help, even though it was their actions that had caused the damage. It was infuriating. The protagonist had been wronged, yet they were the ones who were made to feel like they were the problem. This was gaslighting at its finest, making the victim question their reality and their rights. But in the face of all this, the protagonist held on. They refused to let the lies and manipulation define their reality. They knew the truth, and they were going to make sure the world knew it too. This is a powerful reminder for all of us. When faced with denial, when people try to twist the narrative, it's important to hold firm in our truth. Don't let anyone gaslight you into believing that your suffering isn't real. Stand up, speak out, and demand accountability. The protagonist, now fully aware that the HOA was not just negligent but actively engaged in wrongdoing, found themselves caught in a cycle of frustration and delay. The sewage still flooded their yard, ruining what was left of their home and garden. Every call to the HOA was met with indifference or empty promises. Karen, the president, would say, "We'll send someone next week," or "It's a minor issue, it'll resolve itself." But it never did. As the days dragged on, the protagonist began to realize just how deep the problem ran. This wasn't a simple oversight. It was a deliberate attempt to push them out, to wear them down until they gave up. This situation was taking its toll. It wasn't just the physical destruction that was unbearable. It was the emotional weight. The protagonist found themselves unable to sleep, haunted by the stench of raw sewage seeping into every corner of their home. They couldn't focus on anything else, not even the little things they used to enjoy. Their health began to suffer, and the constant anxiety made them question whether it was worth continuing the fight. The stress was overwhelming, and yet the HOA just carried on, unaffected and unbothered. This period of uncertainty was harder than anything the protagonist had ever faced, but it served as a critical turning point. When everything feels like it's slipping away, we can either sink into despair or rise and fight harder than ever. The protagonist made the painful decision to hold on, despite the setbacks, and in doing so, they found their resolve. Sometimes the greatest battles require the deepest perseverance, and though the world may seem to be against you, the only way forward is to keep moving, even when it feels impossible. This is a lesson for all of us. Setbacks don't define us, but how we respond to them does. The protagonist's struggle, while heart-wrenching, becomes a powerful reminder that we can find strength in our darkest moments. As the protagonist continued to investigate the source of the sewage, they uncovered something that sent shockwaves through their already fragile reality. It wasn't just a mistake, a bad decision by the HOA. No, it was part of a bigger plan, a plan to force the protagonist off their property and make way for a new development. The sewage was just the first step in a long line of calculated moves designed to devalue the property. This wasn't just a random act of negligence. It was deliberate sabotage. The protagonist discovered, through careful investigation, that the HOA had been in bed with local developers for years. The community, once a peaceful and welcoming place, had slowly been sold out by the HOA for personal profit. And the protagonist's home? It was right in the way of the next big development project. The HOA had been pushing the boundaries for a while, making backdoor deals to force homeowners out, purchasing properties at a fraction of their value. And now, it was the protagonist's turn. The more the protagonist dug, the more they realized that they weren't just fighting for their home. They were fighting against a system built on greed and exploitation. This wasn't just a local issue. It was a reflection of a wider problem, one where the powerful few could manipulate systems to crush the little guy. In this realization, the protagonist saw the depth of the battle ahead. It wasn't just about fixing their property anymore. It was about standing up to a system that treated people like pawns in a game of profit. And while it felt like an insurmountable task, the protagonist found the strength to keep going. Because sometimes the hardest battles are the ones worth fighting, even when the stakes are high and the odds are stacked against you. This is a crucial lesson. Never underestimate the hidden agendas that may be at play. Sometimes, what seems like a small inconvenience is part of a larger scheme. Stay vigilant, and don't be afraid to dig deeper, because the truth often lies beneath the surface. One evening, as the sewage continued to flow and the smell lingered, the protagonists sat in their living room, staring at the endless destruction outside. The weight of it all seemed unbearable, and they felt trapped in a cycle they couldn't break. But then something shifted. A small piece of information clicked into place, and suddenly everything started to make sense. A neighbor, an older gentleman who had lived in the neighborhood for years, approached the protagonist with an unsettling story. He had once experienced something similar. His own property had been flooded with sewage by the HOA a year prior. But unlike the protagonist, he hadn't fought back. Instead, he had been forced to sell his home at a significant loss, with the development company swooping in to purchase it at a bargain price. That's when the protagonist understood. This was no accident. This was a pattern. The HOA was systematically pushing people out to make room for lucrative development projects. The realization hit like a ton of bricks. The HOA had been using the sewage flood to devalue the protagonist's property, knowing full well that they couldn't afford to fight back. The homeowners were seen as expendable, their homes nothing more than assets for developers to exploit. This wasn't just an attack on their property, it was an attack on their dignity. The protagonist's anger flared, but so did their sense of purpose. Now that they understood the truth, they couldn't sit idly by. They had to take action, not just for their own home, but for everyone who had been wronged by this corrupt system. They began gathering evidence, reaching out to neighbors, and uncovering the extent of the HOA's greed. It was time to fight back, not just for themselves, but for the entire community. This moment of clarity was a turning point, and it's a powerful reminder for all of us. Sometimes it takes one moment, one revelation, to understand the full scope of a problem. When we gain clarity, we can fight with a purpose and no one can stop us from seeking justice. As the protagonist's investigation deepened, they came to realize they couldn't take on the HOA alone. The odds were too great and the system was too corrupt. But just as things seemed bleak, an unexpected ally appeared, a retired lawyer who lived a few houses down. She had been watching the events unfold and, seeing the protagonist's determination, decided to offer her help. Her name was Jennifer, and though she was retired, she still had the sharp legal mind that had served her well in her past career. Jennifer had seen it all, the manipulation, the corruption, the abuse of power, and she wasn't about to let the HOA continue unchecked. She became the protagonist's sounding board, their guide through the maze of legalities, and the one person who didn't shy away from standing up to the HOA. Jennifer's experience was invaluable. She helped the protagonist understand the legal angles, find loopholes in the HOA's tactics, and most importantly, encourage them when it seemed like there was no hope. Together, they started putting together a case, one that would expose the HOA for the corrupt organization it had become. Jennifer didn't just provide legal advice. She gave the protagonist something more: confidence. She reminded them that sometimes the strongest allies are the ones we least expect, and that the power to make a change often lies in the hands of those who are willing to stand up, even when it seems impossible. Jennifer's presence was a reminder that no matter how difficult the battle, there is always strength in unity. Whether it's friends, family, or even a neighbor, you don't have to fight your battles alone. Help comes in many forms, and sometimes the person who helps you the most is the one you least expected. This is an important lesson. It's okay to ask for help. We all need support at times, and the right person can make all the difference when it feels like you're facing an uphill battle. With Jennifer's help, the protagonists began to gather everything they could to expose the HOA's wrongdoing. They documented every call, took hundreds of photos, and even secretly recorded their conversations with Karen and Howard. It wasn't just about proving that the HOA had flooded their property. It was about exposing a deeper truth, the corruption that ran through the heart of the HOA's leadership. The protagonists knew they couldn't win this battle without the truth, and the truth was in the details. They hired a plumber to inspect the sewage system and found that the pipes weren't just leaking. They were being intentionally rerouted to dump waste directly onto their property. It was a blatant violation of environmental laws, and the plumber's report was the key to proving it. But the power of evidence went beyond just the technical facts. The photos, videos, and testimony from neighbors who had been similarly mistreated painted a clear picture of the HOA's negligence and corruption. The more evidence they gathered, the clearer it became that the HOA's actions were deliberate, and they would stop at nothing to maintain their grip on power. This is a lesson in the importance of documentation. When facing a system that's stacked against you, the truth will be your greatest weapon. Collect the evidence, keep the records, and don't let anyone gaslight you into thinking your reality isn't valid. With the truth on your side, you can't be silenced. As the protagonists dug deeper into the situation, they started to see the bigger picture. It wasn't just about their property being flooded with raw sewage. It was about something much darker. The HOA, which was supposed to represent and protect the interests of homeowners, had become a tool of exploitation. What seemed like a simple mistake was now beginning to reveal itself as a calculated move to push out the current residents and make room for more profitable development. The moment of realization hit hard. The neighborhood that once seemed so welcoming, with its peaceful streets and close-knit community, had been gradually transformed into something far more sinister. The developer's name came up again and again in the research the protagonist uncovered. And there it was, the HOA and the developers had been in cahoots, manipulating property values, making secret deals to force homeowners out. The protagonist's property was not just a house. It was a commodity to be used in their game of profits. This wasn't just about a small property dispute anymore. It was about exposing a system designed to exploit homeowners, forcing them out of their homes for financial gain. They had no choice but to fight back. The stakes were higher than ever. The very fabric of their peaceful life had been torn apart by a group of people who saw them as nothing more than a stepping stone toward greater wealth. This is a lesson that resonates with us all. Sometimes the smallest, seemingly insignificant actions can reveal a much darker truth. Never assume that things are as they seem. Always be willing to question the motives behind actions, especially when they affect your life, your home, and your future. It was during a sleepless night, staring at the devastation in their yard, that the protagonist came to a decision. They had spent days, weeks, even months trying to reason with the HOA, calling the authorities, and doing everything in their power to fix the mess. But it was all in vain. No one was taking responsibility. The authorities were slow to respond, and the HOA was simply denying the truth. The protagonist was at a crossroads. Should they continue down this path of frustration, or should they take a stand, even if it meant risking everything? The decision to fight back wasn't easy. There was fear, doubt, and uncertainty. Could they win? Would they lose everything? The protagonist weighed the consequences of their actions. Fighting a corrupt system could bring severe legal consequences. But as they looked at their ruined garden, their destroyed workshop, the sense of powerlessness faded away, replaced by a determination that they had never known before. The catalyst for this moment of clarity was a simple question. What if I do nothing? What if they let the HOA win, let them push them out? The thought of living in a world where the corrupt prevailed without consequence was simply unbearable. The protagonists knew they had to take action, to fight for what was right. But how? What could they do against a powerful organization like the HOA? In this moment of decision, they realized that sometimes the right choice is not the easiest one. Fighting back wasn't just about seeking revenge. It was about protecting their dignity, their home, and their community. And sometimes, to fight for what's right, you have to be willing to risk everything. This is a critical lesson. Every person reaches a point where they must make a choice whether to accept injustice or to stand up and face it head-on. The hardest decision often leads to the most important transformation point one evening. After a particularly stressful week, the protagonists sat alone in their workshop, trying to make sense of the chaos that had taken over their life. The broken tools, the ruined wood, the memories of projects that would never be finished, they were all part of a nightmare they couldn't escape. Yet, in that moment of despair, something shifted. A memory surfaced, and with it, the truth became undeniable. The sewage issue wasn't a random event, it was orchestrated. They recalled an offhand comment made by a neighbor a few weeks earlier. "This isn't the first time they've done this," the neighbor had said, shaking their head. They forced me out of my place last year, under the same circumstances. My land was flooded with sewage too, and the HOA told me it was just a mistake. That comment had seemed like a throwaway line at the time, but now it was the key that unlocked the entire mystery. The protagonist realized that they weren't the only one. They weren't the only victim of the HOA's manipulation. This was a pattern, a calculated plan to force people out by destroying their property and making it unlivable, just so they could sell it to developers. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate strategy. The flood of sewage wasn't an isolated incident. It was the result of a much larger scheme that had been unfolding behind the scenes for years. This revelation was a turning point for the protagonist. It was no longer just about getting their yard cleaned up. It was about exposing the HOA's lies and the corruption that ran through the organization. They couldn't keep quiet any longer. The fight had become much bigger than their property. It was a battle for justice, for truth, and for the future of their community. The lesson here is clear. Sometimes clarity comes at the most unexpected moments. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by a problem, but sometimes all it takes is one piece of information to shift everything into focus. And when the truth is revealed, there's no going back. In the midst of the protagonist's growing frustration, a new ally emerged. Jennifer, a retired lawyer who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, had watched the protagonist's struggles from a distance. She saw the determination in their eyes, and she knew they were up against something bigger than themselves. Jennifer had faced battles in her own life, but this was personal. She had seen the HOA's tactics before, and she wasn't about to let them ruin another life. Jennifer reached out to the protagonist one evening, offering her help. "I've seen this before," she said. "The lies, the manipulation, the way they target people who don't have the means to fight back. But I've also seen what happens when you stand up to them. It's time someone did." With Jennifer's help, the protagonist gained the legal insight they so desperately needed. She guided them through the maze of legal documents, showing them how to navigate the complex system that had been designed to keep them powerless. She also provided emotional support, reminding them that they didn't have to fight alone. They weren't just battling the HOA, they were battling corruption, greed, and injustice, and together they could win. Jennifer's support was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, we don't have to face our struggles alone. Sometimes, the most unexpected people become our greatest allies. In this case, Jennifer's wisdom and experience gave the protagonist the tools they needed to take on the corrupt system head-on. This is an important lesson for us all. Never underestimate the power of allies, no matter how unexpected they may seem. Help often comes from places we least expect, and when we have someone on our side, the impossible suddenly feels achievable. With Jennifer's help, the protagonist began to piece together the puzzle. They knew the HOA was lying, but now they needed proof. Every conversation, every email, every document, nothing could be left to chance. They meticulously documented every detail, taking photos of the damage, recording conversations, and gathering testimonies from neighbors who had faced similar abuses. The true power of evidence came when the protagonist uncovered a secret document that proved the HOA's guilt. They had uncovered a diversion pipe that had been installed without any public knowledge, and it was the source of the sewage flooding their property. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. The HOA wasn't just negligent. It was engaging in criminal activity, bypassing regulations, and intentionally damaging properties to increase profits. The protagonist hired an independent plumber to verify their findings, and the plumber's report confirmed what they had suspected. This wasn't just an accidental mistake. This was an illegal act carried out by a group of people who thought they could get away with it. The power of evidence was undeniable. Armed with photos, documents, and professional reports, the protagonist had a solid case. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that mattered. It was the story it told. It wasn't just about a flood of sewage. It was about a flood of lies, greed, and corruption. And now they had the proof to expose it all. This is a powerful lesson. In the face of corruption, the truth is your greatest weapon. When you have the facts on your side, no one can silence you. Never stop documenting. Never stop gathering evidence, because the truth will always prevail. With the evidence in hand, the protagonist knew that the time for waiting was over. They had been pushed around, gaslight, and ignored by the HOA for far too long. Now it was time to fight back, not just for themselves, but for every homeowner who had been wronged by the corrupt system. Armed with photos, videos, and a damning report, they were finally ready to expose the truth. The protagonists stood before the HOA at the monthly meeting, their heart racing with anticipation. The room was filled with neighbors, most of whom were either too afraid or too uninformed to speak out. But this time, things were different. The protagonist wasn't going to let them dismiss them again. They walked to the front, connected their tablet to the projector, and began to show the community exactly what had been happening behind the scenes. The images flashed across the screen. Raw sewage flowing freely onto their property, photos of the illegal pipe installed by the HOA, and a video recording of the conversation where Karen had admitted that the HOA had authorized changes to the neighborhood plumbing. The room fell silent. The truth was out, and it hit like a bombshell. Karen tried to intervene, but the damage had already been done. Her smug smile faltered, her face turning pale as she realized that the evidence was undeniable. The community could no longer turn a blind eye to the corruption within their own HOA. The protagonist's simple but powerful act of speaking the truth in front of the community had struck a nerve, and they knew there was no turning back. This is a key lesson. Sometimes the most effective form of revenge is not in retaliation, but in exposing the truth. When you speak up and stand firm in what you know to be right, you gain more power than you ever could through anger or violence. The truth, backed by evidence, has the power to silence lies and break down walls. The meeting left the protagonist both victorious and unsettled. While they had achieved their first small victory, they were also faced with the harsh reality of the situation. Not everyone in the neighborhood was on their side. In fact, some were secretly siding with the HOA, afraid to rock the boat or challenge the powerful figures who had been pulling the strings for years. One of the most disheartening moments came when the protagonist reached out to a neighbor, a man who had always been friendly, only to find out that he had been covering for the HOA. He had warned the protagonist to back off, telling them that the HOA had too much power and that fighting them was a losing battle. The betrayal stung deeply. For someone who had always seemed like an ally to suddenly distance themselves in such a critical moment was a painful reminder of just how much fear and manipulation the HOA had instilled in the community. But this betrayal also helped the protagonist see the bigger picture. The HOA's grip on the neighborhood was built on fear, and fear alone. Those who didn't speak out weren't necessarily against the protagonist, but were simply too afraid of the consequences. However, just when things seemed most uncertain, new allies began to emerge. Neighbors who had watched in silence began to step forward, including some who had been personally hurt by the HOA's actions. The protagonist realized that the fight was no longer just about them. It was a fight for everyone who had been wronged. This is an important lesson. In moments of adversity, it's essential to know who you can trust. And sometimes, it's not the people you expect. Betrayals will sting, but new alliances can emerge in the most unlikely places. Standing for what's right often brings people together who are willing to fight alongside you. The protagonist's investigation continued, and what they discovered was more shocking than they could have imagined. They uncovered not only the illegal plumbing installation, but also evidence of financial corruption within the HOA. The HOA president, Karen, and several board members had been accepting bribes from contractors and developers, bypassing regulations and enriching themselves at the expense of the residents. The more they dug, the more the layers of corruption began to peel away. There were secret accounts, kickbacks, and shady deals that had been hidden from the community for years. The HOA had been systematically exploiting its residents, overcharging for services and funneling money into their own pockets. But the true extent of the corruption became even clearer when the protagonist discovered that Karen's husband's company, a local developer, had been involved in a land deal that included the protagonist's property. It was becoming increasingly apparent that the sewage dumping was no accident. It was part of a deliberate plan to drive the protagonist out and clear the land for development. This is a powerful reminder that when you start to uncover the truth, it often leads to more than you expect. The deeper you dig, the more corruption, greed, and lies are revealed. And while it may seem overwhelming, it's also empowering. The truth is your weapon, and it will always be stronger than any lie. With the full extent of the HOA's corruption laid bare before them, the protagonists found themselves at a crossroads. They had the truth. They had the evidence. But now they had to decide what to do with it. Would they go through the legal channels, hoping that the system would eventually deliver justice? Or would they take matters into their own hands and make the HOA pay for what they had done? The decision wasn't an easy one. The protagonist knew that pursuing the truth could have serious consequences. The HOA was a powerful entity, and the ramifications of exposing them could lead to further retaliation, both legally and personally. But after everything they had endured, the sewage flooding their property, the lies, the manipulation, they couldn't sit back any longer. They had to make a stand. In the quiet of their home, the protagonist thought long and hard about the potential consequences. But in the end, the choice was clear. If the system wasn't going to work, they would make it work. They would fight back, and they would do it in a way that no one would ever forget. It wasn't just about vengeance, it was about justice. This moment of decision is a crucial one. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy, and the path forward is filled with uncertainty. But the hardest decisions are often the ones that lead to the most profound changes. When we're faced with injustice, we must choose whether to stand up, regardless of the personal cost. The protagonist's decision to fight back was not made lightly. They knew that a battle with the HOA would have lasting consequences, but they were resolved. With Jennifer's legal expertise and the support of their neighbors, they began to craft a plan that would make the HOA feel the full weight of their actions. The revenge wasn't going to be the violent kind. No, this was going to be something much more powerful, a disruption of their very system. The protagonist, along with a trusted ally, Ryan, formulated a plan to flood the HOA office. Not with sewage, but with something that would permanently make a statement. They decided to fill the office with a quick-drying industrial foam, one that would resemble concrete, but could be removed without causing permanent damage. It was a symbolic act, a way to make the HOA pay for their years of corruption without destroying the building itself. As night fell, the protagonist and Ryan executed their plan. They worked quickly, pouring the foam into the office, covering the desks, the filing cabinets, and the precious items that Karen had grown so attached to. The office, once a symbol of her power, was now filled with an impenetrable barrier. It would take days, if not weeks, to clean up, and by then, the damage would already be done. The message had been sent. This act of revenge wasn't about anger, it was about justice. It was about showing the HOA that no one is above the law and that actions have consequences. The protagonist had taken a stand, and the whole community would know it. This is a key lesson. Sometimes revenge isn't about destruction. It's about making a point, sending a message. In the end, the greatest form of justice is making sure that those who wrong us feel the weight of their actions. And when we stand up for what's right, we create ripples that can change everything. After the bold act of revenge, the protagonist felt a mixture of satisfaction and fear. The foam had dried, solidified into an almost impenetrable layer, and the HOA office, once full of smug power, now sat in a state of disarray. The destruction wasn't permanent. After all, the foam could be dissolved, but the message was loud and clear. The power had shifted, but as the protagonists stood back and watched the chaos unfold from the shadows, they began to feel the weight of their decision. The question echoed in their mind. Had they done the right thing? The revenge had been sweet, yes, but at what cost? Would the community understand? Would the HOA come after them with legal force? And most importantly, would it be enough to stop the corruption and abuse? The protagonists spent restless nights contemplating the consequences of their actions. They had exposed the truth, made a bold statement, but now they wondered if the damage would be more than just symbolic. Would they be dragged through the courts? Would they lose everything they had worked so hard for? The fear was real, but it didn't overpower the conviction that they had made the right choice. They knew they had been left with no other option. The system had failed them, and this was the only way to get the attention they deserved. This is a key lesson. Revenge, when driven by righteous anger, can feel good in the moment, but it comes with consequences. The weight of those decisions, whether personal or professional, often lingers long after the event. The real question is not what we did, but what we will do next and how we will live with the choices we've made. The next morning, when the news broke, it was a storm. The HOA office was in complete disarray, and every news outlet in town was there, reporting on the mysterious flood of foam. Karen and the other board members were quick to point fingers, claiming the act was one of criminal vandalism, aimed at silencing them. But the community wasn't so sure. Whispers spread quickly through the neighborhood, some of them sympathetic to the protagonist's cause, others condemning the drastic measures. No one was quite sure who had done it, but the fingers of blame seemed to settle on the very people who had been most vocal about standing up to the HOA. Despite the backlash, the protagonist couldn't help but feel vindicated. The cleanup process would take weeks, and during that time, the HOA would be paralyzed. It wasn't just the physical destruction that mattered. It was the complete disruption of the HOA's authority. People were beginning to question everything the HOA had stood for, wondering if the truth was far worse than anyone had known. For the protagonist, the aftermath was bittersweet. While there was a sense of triumph in seeing the HOA squirm, there was also the uncomfortable reality of living with the consequences of their bold action. The neighborhood was split. Some residents were calling for the protagonist's arrest, while others were quietly celebrating the disruption of an unfair system. The lesson here is important. Sometimes taking action against corruption comes with unexpected fallout. We may not have control over how others perceive our actions, and the cost can sometimes be greater than anticipated. But in times of injustice, we must remember that the most courageous acts often bring the most significant changes, and we can't always predict the outcome. As the fallout continued, something unexpected happened. One of the local news stations, after investigating further into the flooding incident, uncovered a shocking detail. The reporter, who had been following the story closely, discovered an email chain that had been accidentally forwarded to the public, an email that contained damning evidence of the HOA's financial misconduct. It was clear now the HOA wasn't just negligent, they were guilty of embezzlement, mismanagement of funds, and collusion with developers. The protagonist had unknowingly triggered a chain of events that no one could have predicted. The investigation into the flood had now opened up an entirely new can of worms. The town was stunned by the revelations. What had once been a simple act of revenge was now the catalyst for exposing an even deeper corruption that had been hiding in plain sight for years. As the community began to demand answers, the protagonist knew that they had not only made the right decision to act, but they had set off a wave of change that could not be stopped. The HOA's grip on the neighborhood was slipping, and now it was clear that the truth could not be buried any longer. This twist of fate is a reminder that sometimes even our boldest actions, though they may seem reckless at the time, can lead to unforeseen consequences that change everything. What may have started as an act of personal revenge can turn into a movement for justice, uncovering truths that change the course of history. With the full extent of the HOA's corruption now exposed, the community began to rally around the protagonist. People who had been silent for so long found their voices. Jennifer, the retired lawyer who had supported the protagonist from the beginning, took a leadership role in organizing a formal investigation into the HOA's practices. Local authorities were now forced to listen, and the town held an emergency meeting to discuss the next steps. As the community came together, they realized the power they had. The HOA had relied on fear and manipulation to control them, but in the face of the truth, they were powerless. The board members, including Karen and Howard, were forced to step down. Legal action was taken, and the once corrupt HOA was dismantled. For the protagonist, the victory was both sweet and humbling. They had been through so much to get to this point, and while the victory was satisfying, it was clear that the real triumph was the collective strength of the community. They had come together, stood up for what was right, and changed the course of their future. This is an important lesson for us all. Change begins with one person, but it requires a collective effort to sustain. In moments of injustice, it's easy to feel isolated, but when we come together, we find the strength to achieve what we once thought impossible. The protagonist's redemption wasn't just in their personal victory, but in the community's decision to reclaim their power. As time passed, the protagonist's life slowly returned to normal. The HOA was gone, replaced by a new board that was genuinely concerned with the needs of the residents. The community had been rebuilt on a foundation of trust, respect, and accountability. The protagonist's garden, once destroyed, had been restored with the help of their neighbors. The workshop, which had been filled with sewage, was now a thriving space once again, and the tools that had been soaked in filth were cleaned and put to good use. Despite the restoration of their physical surroundings, the real transformation took place within. The protagonist had faced down corruption, stood up to a system that sought to oppress them, and emerged victorious. They had learned that even when it feels like the world is against you, standing up for what's right brings its own form of peace. In the end, the protagonist's story became a legend in the community. Their act of resistance had inspired others to stand up for themselves, to question authority, and to demand justice. And while the protagonist would never forget the battle they had fought, they also understood that true peace comes from knowing that justice has been done. This final chapter is a reminder that the struggles we face, while painful, lead us to growth. Sometimes the hardest battles teach us the most valuable lessons, and through those lessons, we find the peace we deserve. The protagonist had fought for their home, for their dignity, and for their community, and in the end, they found not just victory but peace.